One of the problems of a lot of analytic philosophy is that you read these people and it's boring and you don't know how this connects to you as an individual. And partly it's because that's not their project. Bringing home the meaning and significance of a concept can be really important to understanding it and reflecting on it, but it can also drift into making up for the rigor of an argument. So there's a line to be walked there. All right. Today we are going to do a amateur book review on Frederick Copleston's 11th volume of A History of Philosophy entitled Logical Positivism and Existentialism, which is actually not a history of either logical positivism or existentialism, but a series of critical essays regarding both movements. And we'll go over some of the arguments that Coplestone gives in favor and against both of these movements. But before we get into that, I just want to remind you guys that if you guys have any comments, criticisms, any thoughts at all that you'd like to share, please just drop them in the comments and I would be more than happy to respond to those. And I think we'll just get started with a little background on the author here, Frederick Copleston, because he was actually a pretty significant Christian philosopher in his own time. He was born in 1906 and died in 1994, 2 years before I was born. He was a Christian philosopher, a Thomist, as well as a Catholic Jesuit priest and a historian of philosophy who wrote this, I think, originally 9-volume history of philosophy, and then later on added both a history of Russian philosophy as well as this series of critical essays on logical positivism and existentialism. He was also famous for his debate with Bertrand Russell in 1948 on the existence of God. I checked out a little bit of it on YouTube. It's worth listening to. It's sort of conventional on both sides, but still worth giving a listen to. He was rather articulate as well as being a pretty good writer. And then I think a year later, he also debated his friend A.J. Ayer, who was famously known as a logical positivist, and he debated him on positivism and as well as the meaning of religious language. One of the things that I actually found interesting about Frederick Copleston, and I don't know if this is not exactly related to him, but I remember reading the first volume of A History of Philosophy, which is on ancient Greece and I think Rome. And there was a line in there that stuck out to me where he was talking about his philosophical Thomism. And I think this is in the introduction. And of course, being a Thomist is a rather old-fashioned philosophical position. You wouldn't find many people holding on to Thomism as a philosophical belief outside of the Catholic circle. And of course, Frederick Copleston was Catholic and a Jesuit priest. One of the interesting things I think he says in the introduction is something like, just because a philosophy is old doesn't mean it's wrong. Just because a philosophy has fallen out of favor or fallen out of fashion doesn't mean that it's wrong. And perhaps that seemed sort of obvious, but it stuck out to me at the time because I think as you try to chase newer and newer ideas in order to fill out your own philosophical framework or to fill out just your view of the world, it's easy to get caught up with the fashionable philosophy. It's easy to discard one movement just because another movement fell out of favor. I often think about this with existentialism. I'm not sure if I consider myself a true existentialist, though I often deal with similar themes. But the movement pretty much fell out of fashion in the 50s, especially after Sartre, and gave rise to structuralism and post-structuralism and the sort of postmodern philosophy today. And has kind of been a part of me that looks at the philosophy of something like post-structuralism and deconstructionism, and I can see interesting points involved with it, but it's hard for me to make sense of the fact that existentialism fell out of favor, given that the themes are so prescient even today. And there's this temptation, I think, to think, well, because this philosophy, existentialism is no longer in fashion, there must be something fundamentally wrong with it. Of course, there's plenty wrong with existentialism, There's plenty of critical points that you can take on it, like with any philosophy. But just because a philosophy can be criticized, just because it is no longer in fashion, doesn't necessarily mean it was wrong. It can mean that the proponent of the given philosophy or the famous proponents of the given philosophy simply weren't up to the task to it. It could be just that the culture moved on. It could be that the what it's exploring might be too uncomfortable for the wider culture. So you can't just say that because something is fashionable, it is therefore right. And you can't say that just because the philosophy has fallen out of fashion, that it is therefore part of the dustbin. And I think this is obvious when we look at the history of philosophy, where these ideas come up again and again. And in many ways, I look at the post-structuralists and the structuralists as reigniting the debate that Hegel brought up against Kant. But all that being aside, it kind of gave me instant respect for this guy because he's not sort of just kowtowing to the modern doctrines of culture, right? He's clearly a committed Catholic, and he argues in some instances for Catholicism, or at least he makes his position clear. And he's not afraid to stand behind it, even if the philosophy that he stands behind, Thomism, has been largely irrelevant for a long time. And there's a bit of respect you have to give him for that. And it also just reminded me that I need to focus not on the what is fashionably true or what is fashionably the case, but what is actually true. And that matters far more than the kinds of thoughts that are in vogue at any given time. And really just, overall impressions of the work. I really enjoy reading Cobblestone. I think that if you want a more comprehensive introduction to the history of philosophy, you really can't do better than Cobblestone in terms of what I've read. He's much better than other writers like Will Durant or Bertrand Russell himself, some of the more popular histories of philosophy. Though I will have to give mention to a compact version that I really enjoyed was A.C. Grayling's History of Philosophy. I don't know if that's the title, but it's by the philosopher A.C. Grayling, and he actually does a tremendous job in covering the movements as well. Though he comes from a very specific tradition, and he's not really as objective as Copleston is. I think that's one of the most wonderful things about Copleston, is that even though he comes from a very distinct philosophical position, he doesn't allow that to bleed into his rendition of the philosophers and the movements that he presents. He's really fair and he's really objective. He still disagrees, and you can see some of that come out here and there. But in terms of the actual movements and philosophers themselves, he gives quite a faithful representation, quite a fair shake. And like I said, I think you could do. I think this is perhaps one of the better comprehensive philosophies of history. Well worth purchasing, well worth reading. All that being said, as I mentioned before, this particular volume, volume 11, is not really a history. I mean, he overviews both movements and he talks about the major players, so to speak, but it's mostly aimed at a critical examination of both of these movements. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of this video is it's going to be split essentially into two parts. In the first part, we're going to deal with his critique on positivism. And I'll try to restructure or recreate the arguments that he makes over the course of a few chapters. I'll do my best to reconstruct it here. And then after I reconstruct that, I will also give you my take on the movement as well, on logical positivism and existentialism. So in terms of logical positivism, Cobblestone seems to, on the one hand, give a lot of grace to the movement because he sees their fundamental task as something worthwhile. He sees the idea of trying to clarify our concepts more in depth and to tie it into what we actually experience in the world as incredibly beneficial to the philosophical movement. And the renewed energy behind both of those kinds of goals is something that Cobblestone very much appreciates. But his main criticism is that the movement sort of goes too far and it leaves out many of the metaphysical statements or arguments that probably have more value than the positivists assume. The positivists were famous for arguing that if a given proposition could not be verified, if you couldn't produce an observation statement for any given metaphysical argument, that it was essentially rendered meaningless. It would be as meaningless to say something like God exists eternally as it would be to make up a new word. And they did this for the sake of clarity. The positivists in general were reacting against Hegel through specifically the British idealists, and they were trying to cut away all of the vague, essentially garbage concepts that were muddying up philosophy. And they really believed that so much of philosophy had wasted its time in meaningless speculation over unclear terminology, and that the vast majority of philosophical problems would go away if we could come up with a principle for rendering some statements meaningful and some statements meaningless. And that principle for the positivists was essentially the principle of verificationism, the principle that unless you can attach an observed statement to the given speculation, it was for all intents and purposes meaningless. Now, there are different variations of this, but essentially that's what it came down to. And they explained metaphysical speculation and moral speculation as something fundamentally reduced to emotivism, the use of language to evoke emotions in people in order to get them to act in a given circumstances. Now, there are a lot of different takes on this, and the movement developed into linguistic positivism later on with Wittgenstein, but this was the essential thrust of logical positivism. And there are many critiques to it, especially from the continental traditions, some of which are reproduced here in Copleston, and some of which aren't. One thing that's particularly interesting about Copleston is that he was born at the beginning of the century, and this book was actually published in 1956. So by this point, Copleston had seen the rise and almost the peak of logical positivism as a school. So he could really get a good analysis of what was going on here. And I think he makes some good points. The first major point that he makes here is that he believes that logical positivism ultimately doesn't really get beyond Kant's own critique of metaphysics. You see, Kant critiqued metaphysics because he essentially believed that we couldn't get beyond our own experience of the world, our own sense experience. We were sort of trapped within our own minds, so we couldn't get to the things in themselves. And so this ultimately made all metaphysical statements, all statements about the world outside of what we can experience in the categories of our mind, as essentially unknowable, such that the answering of metaphysical questions like whether God is eternal, whether there is absolute being, we were unable to essentially access and therefore get to the truth of. And what Copleston here is saying is that the positivist critique of metaphysics essentially ends up in the same place as Kant did, just in a more elaborate manner. When the positivist critiques a given term that somebody is using, and they're asking for an observation statement about the term, like eternal, what the positivist is really doing is asking for the minor premises which could make up and be used to justify the major premise of eternal, right? So what are the basic components, the observational or logical components that could make up the major premise of something like the existence of the eternal or the existence of the absolute? And when the metaphysician is sort of fuddled by this and can't produce those statements, the positivist is ultimately achieving the same kind of critique that Kant was achieving when he said that this is sort of impossible to actually get knowledge about because we cannot be objective to the fundamentals of existence, because we only experience the world within our own framework, within our own mind, within our own logical category. And so it just brings us back to analyzing Kant and whether we can get to transcendental categories and the arguments that people like Schopenhauer and Hegel and others were bringing against this and methodologies for which we could actually access it. The positivist critique was just a more elaborate version of the original Kantian critique, which landed us with the same kinds of problems. The second critique of positivism that he had was that he believed that the positivist skepticism to metaphysical statements cut them off from investigating the possible importance of these kinds of statements to begin with. So in Copleston's understanding, metaphysical speculation serves to draw attention to the ground of our experiences, right? So the universal kind of experiences that we have, metaphysical speculation draws our attention to it. And then we try to formulate this through linguistics, through words, which proves difficult because there's limits to language. That just because there are difficulties in translating the ground of our experience into actual linguistic terms, it doesn't mean that the very attempt to do that is itself meaningless. It doesn't mean that what people are actually trying to draw your attention to doesn't exist. It means that it comes up against a linguistic barrier. But if you judge a statement by whether or not it accords with a linguistic formula, then you automatically discount many of the kinds of experiences that we have, and you discount our ability to talk about them philosophically. Another way he put this is that you can't judge the supposed meaninglessness of a statement before a person has actually formulated it. But if you refuse to look at the formulation of metaphysical statements altogether, you discourage the attempt to even formulate it, and therefore remove the possibility of even analyzing its meaning in the first place. His third major critique that I could draw from the articles was that despite the positivists' insistence that metaphysical statements are meaningless, they themselves rely on some kind of metaphysic to ground their verification principle, the idea that we need an observation statement, and even the idea that our sense experiences are in some way organized. The example he gives is their use of logical constructions. In Coplestone's understanding, the positivists have a view of the objects of the world as not really objects in the direct organized sense in which we perceive them, but as logical constructions of sense experience. And this is sort of a unifying principle of their experience, and in this way acts as a metaphysical statement which underlies their further epistemological experiences and their claims for verification of them. And so, in some way, the positivists have to rely on a kind of metaphysic, a speculated metaphysic, to even get to a principle like verifications or observation statements. Another example you could use of this would be like causality. Causality is necessary for the scheme to work in positivism. So they need some kind of metaphysics to get off the ground here and to fill in their epistemological approach to the world. And the question is, if all metaphysical statements are simply meaningless, then where does the logical positivists draw the metaphysical principles of their own epistemological approach? The last criticism he has of logical positivism is that the problems with which metaphysicians continue to present the world with are problems which continue to recur regardless of whether the logical positivist sweeps them away as meaningless or not. The experiences of God and meaning and being and causality, these all represent problems that people wrestle with in their everyday experience of the world. The positivist has to give something more substantial than simply wishing them away as meaningless. So what is my take on the whole logical positivism movement? Well, in the first place, I agree with Copplestone that the actual thrust of logical positivism was pretty healthy, I think, for philosophy in general. At that point, Hegel and idealism was really taking over philosophy as a whole, and there was a real danger that philosophy would just continue to go off into more and more detached abstraction that wasn't connected to anything, where the philosophers would compete with one another for more and more profound word vomit rather than getting to the actual solid physical and phenomenological experience of people in general. And I think logical positivism came at a good time to cut away this overgrowth of profundity, overgrowth of emotivism, and overgrowth of really the lack of discipline when it comes to clarity. The biggest problem with logical positivism is the obsession with clarity, the clarity as the guiding principle of the entire movement, because it turns out, as Wittgenstein would find out, that language in particular is much less solid than what we take it to be. It's a kind of game. It's a kind of contextual molding. And to try to pin it down in any specific way where you can say these are the rules, and any statement which does not conform to these rules is therefore meaningless, is to do something arbitrary with language and to try to narrow it in confines which are not natural to it. Beyond that, what is meaningful is not always explicitly communicable. And while philosophy is, on the one hand, about being able to communicate truths to other people, it begins in the experience of the incommunicable self. It begins in the phenomenological experience of the individual, which in many ways is uncommunicable. It only then gets narrowed down into language as a process of philosophy. But the question is, what is philosophy for? Is philosophy uh, only for what can be understood between people, or is it for the sake of the individual? Principally, I believe that it is for the sake of the individual principally. And of course, the use of language between the individual and another individual can be radically different, but the meaning still holds for the individual who is using it. And that's not the extent or the whole of philosophy, but it is the foundation of philosophy. And so when you make clarity of concept your overriding principle, you pin philosophy down too narrowly, and you cut out all kinds of important aspects of human existence, like ethics, like God, like phenomenological experience, which don't fit neatly into analytic categories of language. I think one of the failures of the logical positivist movement is that it came about in the early part of the 20th century at a time when, people really needed guidance, especially moral guidance and moral understanding about how to live and how to go about in the world. And because the positivists and the analytics were so obsessed with clarity of concept, they didn't feel comfortable at that time philosophically approaching any of these issues in a substantial way that could actually impact people. I mean, people like Bertrand Russell would go out and give these moralizing speeches to the British people while philosophically saying that such statements were either meaningless, unable to be verified, linguistically complicated, or simply emotive. And I think this is the natural consequence of a philosophical approach that systematically cuts out so many things which are important to people and really important to society in general. The entire movement started as a reaction against the confused language of the idealists and of the outgrowths of Hegel. But what ended up happening in the 20th century is that the entire logical positivist movement essentially ceded the ground of meaning and ethics to the continental school, who are not known for their clarity of concept. And in some ways, that produced some disastrous consequences, arguably. I think part of what it means to be a philosopher is to engage with and approach problems of ethics, problems of God, problems of meaning, problems of phenomenology. And while clarity of concept is a good guiding principle, it cannot be the ultimate principle without entirely destroying what I think the meaning of philosophy is, which is how do we live a meaningfully good life? I very much agree with Cobblestone's criticism of logical positivism not really getting beyond the Kantian critique. I think that's probably the more original one I've seen here. At least I haven't seen that argument, that criticism before. Maybe other people have made it, but I agree with Cobblestone that it really doesn't get to any more of a criticism than what Kant made in saying we can't get outside of our own, experience of the world and the logical categories of our mind. Therefore, metaphysical statements are difficult to, well, for Kant, they're impossible to get to. But, other later philosophers like Hegel and like Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, they provided paths out of this. So it's not clear to me what logical positivism is doing that's unique. I also think the principle of verificationism suffers from itself because this is the most common criticism of positivism in general, but how do you verify the principle of verification? Well, that ties right back down to positivists relying on some sort of metaphysical ground to make the statement that they are positing, and to the inescapable nature of metaphysical problems, which Coplestone mentions here. But I think the movement as a whole was a great benefit to philosophy. I wish that the academic departments and the universities hadn't been, completely overtaken by it, and now they've burned into linguistic analytics, and the analytic movement in general has come to really dominate at least the Anglophone world of philosophy. And now that those universities are majorly funded by public sources or subsidized or protected, many university departments have become solidified in this one way of doing philosophy. And I think it leaves a lot to be desired. They're interesting analytic philosophers, but for the most part, I think it ends up being too piecemeal and rigid and too focused on clarity of concept to end up being useful to the average individual. With all that being said, we can get into his criticism of existentialism. So this will hit harder at the heart of my own philosophy. Again, not really an existentialist, but I rely on at least phenomenology to a significant degree. So it'll be interesting to just talk about what he says here. The first thing he says is that existentialism tends to rephrase trivial facts. So it reminds me of when you hear phenomenologists say, I exist in the ground of being, right? And this is sort of just, isn't this just rephrasing the fact that you exist, right? And you can find a number of these in phenomenology. I think especially in the case of Heidegger, where you're saying things with sort of everybody knows, right? Like Heidegger talks about dying one day. And this is not something that people are ignorant of. They know that they exist in a world. They know that they're going to die. They know that they come into conflicts with other people. They know that they have choices to make. They know that to one extent that they are free. They know that they can be more or less authentic. So, when somebody like myself says the purpose of life is to be yourself, this is almost trivial. And every part of that statement is trivial. When someone says you are yourself, it's almost trivial. And that's fair. I think oftentimes because phenomenologists and existentialists are trying to get to the basics of human experience. And the basics of human experience are, of course, those things that everybody encounters, like death and being and anxiety and choice and identity. But it's fair to say it often just kind of repeats things that people already know. He makes it into that it can drift into overly emotive language. So this is the idea that existentialists can often try to make up for the rigorousness of their argument, of the clarity of concept, by bringing in emotional language or rhetoric and sort of almost artificially driving up the actual emotional experience of things like the fact that we're going to die. And it does this by sort of drawing in your awareness to this one concept as if that was the only thing that you are. That's the only thing to your existence, which again, I think that's a part of the methodology, right? You read Jaspers, you read Sartre, you read Camus. Even Camus, right? He starts with the question of suicide. Talk about something that's going to trigger anxiety, right? And get you right into the emotional mindset that Camus is trying to get you in something like the myth of Sisyphus. I think there's a function to that. You're trying to heighten something that people aren't necessarily paying attention to, but it can get overly rhetorical. And there's a certain fatigue to it, right? Try to read existentialists over and over and over again, like go from one to the other, and you get this sort of emotional fatigue where everything that they start saying sounds almost blurred and dead because your nerves are fried from how often they're sort of evoking these emotions in you through their writing. Their writing is literary, and in that way, it can try to make up for rigorous argument through literary language. In my opinion, there's a balance to be had there. One of the problems of a lot of analytic philosophy, logical positivism, is that you read these people and it's boring, right? And you don't know how this connects to you as an individual. And partly it's because that's not their project, right? But bringing home the meaning and significance of a concept can be really important to understanding it and reflecting on it. But it can also drift into making up for the rigor of an argument. So there's a line to be walked there. His next criticism is that the sort of existentialism can make you overly withdrawn and self-concerned. Many of the questions, of course, coming right out of Kierkegaard are focused on the individual. And to the extent that many existentialists bridge the gap to society is only through the self-concern of the individual, only through the self-valuation of the individual. It's only through how the individual experiences it, because they're trying to get you out of this abstracted notion of yourself and this abstracted notion of society and get you to how are you directly experiencing it. But a lot of the times, the way that the people really actually live is they live in the abstracted understanding. They view themselves as part of the whole. They're not being self-reflective. They're participating actively in the world around them in an unself-conscious way. And Cocklestone's criticism here is essentially that existentialism can exaggerate the self-concerned experience and make one withdrawn and make oneself self-obsessed and see the world only through one's own eye instead of sort of imagining the world as a whole as it sort of may more objectively be. Which is, honestly, I think that's a very fair criticism, because the fact is that there's dual relations. There's the phenomenal experience of the world, but then there's the objective fact of the world. And while in my own opinion, these exist at the same time, and we only experience it from one end, there is the argument you can make for purposely trying to get to the objectivity of the world. And I think you can see sort of caricatures of the existentialist type in the writings of somebody like Dostoevsky, in the way that they even just talk about the people around them. You can kind of get to the negative caricature of the existentialist mode by reading somebody like him. The next criticism, which is pretty much right on point, is the lack of clarity with the entire movement. I mean, this is, I think, particularly egregious in the case of Sartre, but terms like nothingness, freedom, choice, self, I mean, a lot of these things get stated and not defined, or the way they get defined is rather incoherent. This is really kind of especially the case with Sartre's nothing, because, and this is something that Copleston points out, is that Sartre acts like nothing means nothing in the conventional sense, but the function of nothing within his phenomenology is to be something. So, and that's never really clarified as much as it's asserted. The last criticism he has is that existentialists have an exaggerated objection to objectivity. This, again, kind of comes out of Kierkegaard, who's the father of the tradition here. And Kierkegaard was very much focused on his own subjectivity. He famously said that subjectivity is truth, meaning that the experience that I have of the world is as true as the so-called objective world itself. But this leads in the movement to a one-sidedness. It leads to the focus on the truth of one's own subjective experience rather than the truth of the objective world. And Coplestone's point is essentially that all philosophy, he literally says, all philosophy inevitably involves universalization and objectification. I'm not sure I would go so far, because a lot of philosophy is done individually. But in terms of how philosophy can be communicated between people, it is true that it must be communicated in a way that involves universalization and objectification. So whenever you're taking the phenomenological approach, you kind of have to still lift it up into the area of abstraction and submit to the objectification of your own ideas, or else they won't have any connection to anybody else or anything that's going on. But there is a tendency in existentialism to disdain that whole objectification process. And my counter to this would be like, well, that's kind of the point, right? That the Kierkegaard and the phenomenological approach and the existential approach comes out of reaction against philosophy being only about objectivity, only about the world out there rather than the truth in here. And it's meant to be a counter or a counterweight to that. And yes, it can get exaggerated, and yes, it suffers from the problem of subjectivity in general. But the authors, Jasper, Sartre, Kierkegaard, Camus, all these different authors, they are trying to do exactly what Copplestone argues against here. They're trying to make their subjective truth objective, their particular realization into a universal. And part of their method is to experiment with what's going to work, right? Like Kierkegaard's indirect communication exists particularly for this purpose. He's not trying to prove it to you in sort of a syllogistic way that points you to an abstract generalization. He's trying to steer your awareness to something within your experience or the world that he thinks is there. And this is necessarily indirect. It's through language, but it's like language ricocheting in your own brain to move you in a certain direction, not to prove something to you. And that's a methodology of existentialism. It doesn't necessarily fit neatly within traditional philosophy, but it's kind of the point of existentialism, is to push back against objectivity or the privilege of objectivity. Nonetheless, it faces the problem of having to translate itself into objective and universal terms. So the fact that there's that tension isn't surprising to me. Certainly that's where existentialism runs into the problem of communicating itself. And then he kind of ends, I mean, actually he's pretty positive throughout the critical essays to the entire movement, but he says that nonetheless, existentialists are dealing with real problems that pertain to the existing individual in the world and seem to be perennial, like the meaning of existence in particular, and the experience of value, and coming into conflict with things like death and anxiety and the other. So he nonetheless concedes that the existentialists are dealing with important issues, and even if they seem sometimes trivial or they drift into like despite all the criticisms that he's made here, what they're trying to do is draw attention to certain facets of the individual human experience, which is exactly kind of what I'm saying. I think that when you're trying to draw attention to a subjective experience in another person, you are going to run into all the kinds of problems that Copleston talks about here: the trivial facts, the emotive language, the self-concern, the lack of clarity, the objection to objectivity. I mean, you're going to run into all of that as a result of trying to draw somebody else's attention to a fundamentally subjective experience, because it's not like an object. It's not something that we share direct experience of together. It's an isolated epistemology, and that's difficult to take. Well, that's difficult to communicate. And my take on existentialism, well, it's hard to know what existentialism really is. I'll say I vibe with the existentialism in the Kierkegaardian tradition, with people like, of course, Kierkegaard, Sartre, Camus, Merleau-Ponty, these kinds of guys who were interested in the individual experience and their confrontation with the world for its own sake, and tried to explore that. Whether they do that successfully or not, I'm not sure any of them have done it more successfully than Kierkegaard himself did. In my own philosophy, I don't necessarily consider myself an existentialist, but in my own philosophy, the experience of the individual is a starting point by which we go on to examine the objective world, such that we find the objective world through the individual, and we refuse to let go of the individual's meaning in the process. No, I am still interested in objectivity for the sake of the self, for the sake of the individual, essentially. I'm less interested in somebody like Heidegger, because he's not fundamentally concerned with the individual. He's not fundamentally concerned with Dasein. He was concerned to understand ontology, and Dasein was his experimentation of a method to that. And as soon as he sort of gets there, he discards the individual, because he doesn't actually care about the individual. He wasn't interested in teaching people how to live. Oftentimes, his conversations on authenticity are misinterpreted as a normative call to be more authentic in your life. But Heidegger didn't really care whether you were authentic or inauthentic. He was simply examining this foundational aspect of Dasein in order to try to get to the meaning of being, which was his more central concern. So he is trying to get to being through the individual, but he's not all that concerned about the individual. He was happy for the individual to just be part of the crowd as much as he was happy for the individual to be an individual. So it's hard to know if he counts, because I don't know if he takes the meaning and the morality and the normativity of the individual all that seriously, like the value of the individual all that seriously. But nonetheless, his examination gave so much more fruit for existentialists down the line that he's somebody you have to study. Well, whether he himself was actually concerned to be in that mode, I'm going to say almost absolutely not. In terms of the value of the entire movement, I think it was a crucial corrective to philosophy up until that tradition. I think Kierkegaard's critique of Hegel in particular was was incredibly apt. I think the insistence on the fact that we do not experience the world as abstracted categories, but as individuals with our own meanings and purposes and designs, and that value is irreducible to the individual, and that the individual should take seriously their own experiences of the world. They should treat their subjectivity as a truth, not the truth, but as a truth, was an incredibly important corrective to philosophy, which had become entirely abstract, which had discounted the individual time and time again, and which gave birth to a century of totalitarian dictatorships who cared little about the individual and cared all about the state. Again, whether the existentialists were actually successful in combating that, I don't know, but especially, somebody like Sartre can be admired because in a time where the world really needed it, he tried to develop a philosophy of freedom and responsibility and respect for the individual and their experience of the world. And of course, there were problems with that formulations. It was unclear at certain points, but he actually stepped forward and did that in time when it was needed, along with many of the other existentialists of his time. And that's something I think that you can give enormous respect to. And beyond that, I still believe that the phenomenological method in particular is crucial to be able to explore the truth of your own subjective experience in relation to the objective world and to sort of fuse those together in the most meaningful way. With all that said, what are your guys' thoughts? Do you think I got this analysis of this book correct if you've read it yourself? Do you think that these criticisms that Copplestone has brought up still hold against the traditions of positivism and existentialism? Do you think that my takes on these two movements were good, bad? You have anything to add? Please put it down in the comments. Let me know. I would love to be able to talk with you guys more about all these different kinds of things. If you like this video, please give it a like. If you think somebody else would benefit from this video, please share it with them. And if you want more videos like this, then please subscribe. And I'll talk to you guys next time.